Good evening, and we are here with a very limited attendance. Apparently the Oivim have managed to frighten off the Bnei Yisrael, but anyway, we're here. And we are going to review Bezrat Hashem, the Shir on Shabbos on Parshat Noach. So if you look at the Haftarah, it's quite clear we have two of the Haftarahs of Nechamusa all of a sudden here at Noach. And you would have thought that, look, we've been through the entire time. We've gone from Shivas B'Tammuz all the way through Tisha B'Av. We've had the Shiva Nechamusa. We completed Yom Kippurim, the Luchas Shniyim. We've come to the getter of Tshuva in the world through Sukkot, in which it's difficult to conceive that we're still being Eised in Nechama, and yet it's obvious that the idea of Nechama must have some kind of fundamental relationship to Yinachamenu, despite the fact that Rashi says Yinachamenu would mean Yaniach Lanu as opposed to Nechama, but as the Radak points out, that itself is Nechama, and he brings the Medrash. The Medrash says the name should have been Menachem and so on, which is what Rashi's Raya was. So this is Meramis, the different levels of Noach, but it's obvious that the elements of Nechama, which begins with Vayinachem on Brias HaAdam, in terms of Machshava Acheres, and freshness, and newness, and the clarity of how Nechama is always a new Machshava, a new way to begin, it's got to relate to the fundamental new Parsha, the discovery of a completely new world, as we'll see, which is Yonah. And basically, which is Noach, which relates, of course, to Yonah as well, because the idea of, as the Rosh points out, he makes an analysis that the original setting out of the Yonah was on Shivas B'Tammuz, in which case the final going out is in Av, relates to Tu B'Av, brings us to Nechama, even in terms of Yonah Matzah Bo Manoach. We know that that relates all the way back to Eliyahu Hanavi and his transition from being a Mikaneh, and this is where, as opposed to the Yonah, the Orev was there ad Yaboshet Hamayim because it was a remes to him that he needed to take on a completely new Hanhaga, which was the Hanhaga here of Vayarach Hashem Esreach Anichayach, which becomes now Yetzer Lev Adam, Ramin Urav, and a new level of tolerance that Eliyahu doesn't have, and which is called for, and therefore becomes Elisha and the fathering of Yonah. The whole thing is amazing. Out of the Orev, which was the one that was the Beit Tafcha the Achav, actually brings to Eliyahu, and this is Achav's taina, that he's the Eicher Yisrael, not Achav is the Eicher Yisrael. But the person who is defining Yisrael wrongly, it's about Achav taina is indeed. Sorry, let me just plug that in. Is indeed Eliyahu himself. And indeed, many of the inyanim that we've been racing in Sukkot proper continue here, because the idea of the discovery of Ruach HaKodesh is addressed here directly in Hanochas HaTeva by the Balaturim, who says that Vatanach HaTeva, there's only one other place that we find Vatanach in all of Tanakh, and that is Vatanach Alayim HaRuach, where, amazingly, we appoint the Shivim, which of course here starts with the Shivim Mumais, which become in the end the Shivim of Sanhedrin, with the Shivim Lashenais, which is part of what Sanhedrin has to do. And there it's Vatanach Alayim HaRuach to show that it was the getter of Ruach HaKodesh and the Vias that's there. So that means that essentially, until we understand the real meaning of the Avodas Hamayim and the nature of the Shittim and their connection to the Tahom, which of course is the entire story here of the Tahom Rabbah, and the idea of how it is that these elements become the Yonah Matzah Bo Manoach, which the Medrash relates to Klal Yisrael. Many of the Mefarshim relate to Klal Yisrael. Why is Klal Yisrael called Yonah? And what does it mean to be Motzei Menucha, specifically in this way, in which the Reach HaNichayach of the Chen, which is found here, somehow defines the Chanotiach Asher Achon, in the end to Yisrael, becomes the Brit of the Yud Gimel Midas to Yisrael, all through Moshe, who of course is the new reincarnation of Noach, which is why he keeps saying, Ki matzati chen be'einecha, because after all, the original Moshe was the Me'av Esrim Shana, V'shegam hu basar, which becomes the Teva of Moshe out of the Teva of the original Noach. This Barumas and many, many things that occur later on, even from our Haftorah, Ki mei Noach, Zotli, Asher nishbati me'avor mei Noach. So this is related to, points out the Megala Amukes, to Moshe Rabbeinu's ultimate tefillah, which is, his tefillah is, Mecheni na misifracha, Mecheni obviously going back to Emche et Adam, the Mecheni na misifracha is because I absolutely refuse to be responsible for the Mei Noach. Mecheni spells Mei Noach. Right? So in other words, the first time indeed, I was considered to be responsible because Mei Noach, and if that's the case, then don't make me a big nation. Absolutely not. That's what they say about Noach. Yeah, well, as long as we're safe, the whole world can be drowned. That's not my approach. So there's clearly amazing transitions here, the entire nature of the relationship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Yisrael that comes somehow from here, which doesn't seem to make sense because this should be the relationship to the Shivim Umais, not to the Shivim of Yisrael and Sanhedrin. This should be the relationship of the getter of the Vias, the Bilam, not to Moshe. We're talking about over here, B'nai Noach particularly. There should be a chen which relates to Adam Uve'ema Toshia Hashem, which is Keneged Noach and Keneged Ninveh, and of course Yonah again, which is the same Medrash that points out the Adam Uve'ema Toshia Hashem. Somehow it seems to have its roots right here, and that's basically how the Zohar defines Moshe saying, I don't want to make the same mistake twice, which is why he says, Mecheni, not to undo the Mei Noach Zotli, which is here the actual meaning of the entire Chen and Mitzias Chen in transition. Even the song that we sing on Shabbos, of the Yonah Matzah Bo Manoach, which itself is a remez to the idea of Sukkot, which is the Sukkot Shlomecha, and we changed the entire nusach of the bracha to be the Sukkot Rachamim, Chayim, V'Sholem, specifically on Yerushalayim, which is now the Mokum, where we learn out the dinim of Sukkah as opposed to the Sukkah here, which is a continuation of the Eid Yaleh, and the Yonah Matzah Bo Manoach, which we use for Shabbos, is itself a remez to Ruach HaKodesh, as Rashi says in Yirmiyahu, when Baruch ben Neriah says it's not fair that I don't have any, basically that's what he's meramis to. Why is it that lo matzati menucha? So Rashi says, what's he saying, lo matzati menucha? Because why is it that until now, those who were mishamesh, the people who had Ruach HaKodesh, got Ruach HaKodesh. And I am being mishamesh, Yirmiyahu, and I don't have Ruach HaKodesh, and I don't have the Vias. The Rambam turns this question into a halacha, as we'll see in a moment. But as Rashi explains a little, lo matzati manoach. Manoach is itself a lashon of Ruach HaKodesh, which is, of course, vatonach hateva, which takes us back to the Baal HaTurim, which means itself that we're continuing the entire derech of the discovery of the new level of Ruach HaKodesh, which is the continuation of Sukkah, and the Rambam's halacha, which he bases on the Zilchus Yesodei HaTorah, which he just throws in as this throwaway comment, which becomes a halacha on its own, when he's describing the nature of B'nai HaNevi'im, which Rashi brings is exactly the question, because as we explained on Sukkah itself, the Shana Rabbah, the only way of understanding the nature of Shimush and being able to enter the mind space of Moshe Rabbeinu for Yoshua, and the difference between the Mesiras HaTorah to Yoshua, the mind space of where every Talmud enters the mind space of the Rav, is the nature of the B'nai HaNevi'im. That's what they're called, B'nai HaNevi'im. Specifically, we stress the relationship of love and intimacy more by Nevi'is than anywhere else, because concepts you can give over, and people can mistake that for learning. But Nevi'is is not shaykh to give over, and therefore would only be begetter bonim. So even though really kol hatalmidim are nikroim bonim, but by Nevi'is, it's absolute, that it's the only nature of the Talmud. So Mamela, the Rambam, when he's describing B'nai HaNevi'im, he has a throwaway line, which the line reads, and even though they do everything right, these B'nai Hanafim and the Meshamish, period. What's that? That's Baruch B'nai Riyah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends back to him, you're lucky to be alive, baby. Don't be Mavakesh Gedulot. In those years, in this period of Churban.
But is there a difference in terms of who's allowed? Is it just that the time is duration or not duration? Or?
It's many things. It could be anything, as the Rambam says. There's no guarantees. Why? Because it's a relationship. So if you're talking about things that have to do with Yagati umatzati, Yagati velo matzati al tame, but that's not said on Noach. That's the point. So those things which have elements of the mechanic, fine. So if it's mechanical, then there's a haftarah. You're going to learn. And as Taisa says, even la halacha b'nogei the Dorim, it's not considered to be Peschem b'neilad for Rabbi Akiva to tell Kal Shavua, and al daite de Adam Gadol, which Taisa says, what do you mean al daite de Adam Gadol? But that's neilad. I mean, who would think that Rabbi Akiva is going to be an Adam Gadol? He says no, because he had already gone to learn. So the derech of somebody that goes to learn is that he's a little gedula. That's why he went. So why is that neilad? That's more normal. Mashenka, you see that is not the normal relationship in the Nevi'im. In any event, it's clear that we're not reading anything into things here by looking at this as being fundamentally an opportunity to translate everything that came out of the previous year into the new year. And of course, that's exactly the point of Noach, because as the Zohar points out, the Teva is a sukkah. It's a very strange sukkah because it is completely sealed off. It doesn't seem to have tzel. The nature of the sukkah and the remes, the chokhmah of the sukkah with the necessarily the three walls, and over here it seems to be a dirat kva in the ultimate sense, right? And yet the reason here that it's a sukkah is because it's this opportunity of translation of what was into a completely new world. That's the idea. And even though over here it needs to be a kosher sukkah in a sense, because it has to be the techalena l'maylamala. That's the din of tefach. The din is that a sukkah that is made by leaning the two sides together, the way the teva isn't kosher unless there's a tefach. so you have the elamat techalena milamala to provide that there needs to be at least we have a share of a tefach l'mala. Yeah, fine, okay. It's emotions being in the Rambam, very sweet. Okay, so what this is really is a type of sukkah which goes beyond sukkahs. Why does it go beyond sukkahs? Because, okay, we understand that the transition of sukkah into the year pashtas is going to go back to the year Simchas Torah, and this becomes the livui, the idea of livyas, and we continue to walk through the year with what it is that we achieved in sukkahs. But the idea over here is a different sukkah. This is Superman sukkah, basically, as we've pointed out. In other words, the idea of Noach's family recognizing at the onset that Zayinach Hamenu, with an understanding that we are doomed, basically. We are doomed. It's not going to work. Is the understanding that he's got to be put into a spaceship and get out of here. And ultimately, the Zayinach Hamenu is, in a real sense, a completely different planet, a totally new world, which is what the Earth becomes, really, for him. And that's to such an extent that it needs to be wiped out till the surface of the planet looks different. It's a new surface that he came out, Hakol Nasegarit. Basically, he's looking at a totally different planet that's not recognizable, even as where he was. And this is the idea of the Teshuvah Kein Teduro, bring in your best Kalim. But in this sense, it's not open still to the world where it came from. It means that it needs to be a completely new world. We have here, in that sense, we have here the beginning of a completely new history. And that's really the Sugya in Rosh Hashanah, which the idea over there is we have the Machlokes, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer, about Brias Ha'olam, Nisan, Tishrei. We have the strangest thing. in which we paskin like Rebbe Eliezer when it comes to the Mabul, and like Rabbi Yeshua when it comes to Brias Hayom. What is that supposed to mean? And what does the Mabul mean? So Rashi says the Mabul means history, events. Events are dated Mabul-wise, as if the world would begin in Tishrei. So if that's the case, why do we have Zayom Tchilat Ma'asecha? Why do we have Hayom Harat Olam on Rosh Hashanah if it turns out that we're going to pass and that it's really B'Nisan? That's this amazing Chiddush, which we'll see is extremely important later on, which distinguishes indeed, as we just did, between Talmidim and B'nai Hanavim. Hayom Harat Olam is conceptual space. Harat means concept, Yirayon, conception. Doesn't mean anything actually happened. Mashain came the actuality, for that we would paskin in terms of Rabbi Yeshua. It's very, very strange. So it means we have two completely different ways of relating to the world.
So we count the paskin.
On Monday. No, yes, that's right.
But it should be the opposite of that.
No, that's the point. Well, the way that we relate to things in what they mean to us, as if they're historical events, but we understand that we don't really give any real meaning to that historicity. Well, that's what the whole sugya is saying. What's the difference? This is how we're going to count it for this, how we count it for that, essentially. But the beautiful point is that the two levels of interrelationship are expressed in fantastic ways in which we look at the world in different ways. In other words, what we've always understood is that this period is not historic. So in other words, the moment that you have, first of all, the statement of Chazal, that the period is part of Tov, so it's Alpayim Tov, right? So that we understand that means by definition, things are still in transition. They haven't settled. And because of that, because that's a code word for my separations, that's the Olamite Tov Vavo, and of course it's all about the tone. And what it means is that we do not even have a desire to provide any history from our point of view to the period, in the same way that we don't have any desire to apply history to Gan Eden. It's something that is outside of history. It's part of the formation of what the world is and describes the formation of humanity. But on the same level, the things that happen here until the end of Alpayim Tov are describing the formation of some other element of Adam, which we need to discuss. But we see this in so many different ways, that the Torah discusses things as a distinction. It's not Tosus and Chiddush, sounds like a tremendous Chiddush. But the fact is, we have the Gemara in Chagig about the Tatka Ad Deiros. What's the David Sivala Elev Dor? What's natural Elev Dor? It was 26 generations. How do you get Elev Dor? What happened to the invisible Tatka Ad Dorot, as the Gemara says? Well, that's Asher Kum Tu, as the Pasuk says. Kodesh Baruch Hu pinched them, so that means we sort of compress them and we flip them into every generation. What is that supposed to mean? It's a completely different tfisa of the interrelationship of concepts to what we experience as history, which is why obviously there's no connection of the Mabul to the world as we know it. There's no remuzim in geology to any kind of Mabul, or just as there's no real fundamental one-to-one connection to any of the inyanim of Ma'aseh Bereshis. And that makes so much sense because, a very simple reason, there isn't even a historical external reference during the time of the Mabul. Everything is always spoken about in terms of itself. It was X number of days of the Mabul, or it was such and such a year of Noach. It has nothing to do with anything else, and it's so confusing. What do you mean Bishnas? No, that means Bishnas when we started. How do you date something to itself? But there's a clear reason for having to do that, because the Mazolos were not Mishamish, as Rashi brings the Medrash, right? So that means that since we see afterwards that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to be maftiach, that, well, things will go on and this won't happen anymore. So that means this is a fundamental discontinuity. For you to search for some kind of connection is just mythic. It has absolutely nothing to do with the way you view history. So all of this is idiotic. People living 1,000 years, 500 years, having kids when they're 600. What are you talking about? This doesn't happen on our planet. There's no record of such a thing ever happening. We know lifespans were more like 20 years, not 2,000 years. And nothing else seems to have any connection to anything. But that's the whole point. And one of the most stunning things, as Moshe pointed out, is the constellations. That's brilliant. So the Rambam goes out of his way to point out in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, okay, so he's telling us about the 12 constellations and their relationship to the idea of how it is that we count the months and so on and so forth, by giving sufficient information. So now we understand that you can be mechashev tkufas and mazolos. So he points out, but of course, nowadays there's no relationship of the months to the constellations. The only relationship of the months to the constellations was at the post-Mabul moment. So you can only trace this back to the Mabul. Because if you measure the actual precession of the equinoxes, and you take where the relationship of Nisan is currently to Shor, you work it back, you come out at the Mabul. So the development of the Shivim Lashainais and the Shivim Umais, who gave these funny names to what they perceived in the sky, is a Mabul function, which means that you cannot take seriously the relationship of the Earth to the universe outside, because that's what constellations mean. As a matter of fact, the Rambam brings the whole halacha in terms of that interrelationship, obviously in pre-Copernican terms. But what in the Aristotelian vision is the ninth sphere, which doesn't contain anything in it, and therefore you cannot measure anything except by what's in front of it. Aha! But that's, for all intents and purposes, exactly the way we look at the universe outside. How do we know where we fit in terms of the Milky Way? How do we know where we fit in terms of the universe? The only way we can do that is find something that seems more or less permanent in the sky and see how our star relates to those patterns, right? So if those patterns themselves are moving, which causes the precession of the equinoxes, then you have a little bit of a problem. So basically, take it before that, you have absolutely no real sense of where the Earth is in the universe, because you never even made the step of creating pictures that would allow you to find your place. That's the amazing godless of the constellations. It means that the first search for finding your place in the universe is post-Mabul. It's amazing. On the other hand, the interrelationship of that idea, which is historic, it's the way we think about ourselves in reality. The constellations are an expression of how we think about ourselves within the universe. History is a question of what patterns we see in how we perceive our own development or our own lives on a personal level of memories. The fact that we start that at the Mabul, and yet we have an attempt to bring the best kalim, so to speak, into the spaceship, that was the Teva from the original planet Earth. That idea is, unbelievably, our relationship of tkufes, not mazoles. We're throwing all things together. The tkufes and mazoles. No, the tkufes of the Shemesh and the Yareach are based on a nearly fictitious idea, in which it's so fictitious that we manage to pretend that there's such a thing as the Mailad, which is all ridiculous. The Mailad that we announce in Shul has nothing to do with anything. It's an average orbit of the moon, and it will almost never happen that it's real, the Mailad. It would be about as likely to happen as a stopped clock, being exactly the moment you look at it, it's perfect time. I mean, it's really, what are the chances of such a thing? So the entire thing is counted back la'alocha to what is found in halacha as Shnat HaTohu. Because we measure it back to year -1, or year 0, because we don't have the presence of Adam yet. So we can't really call it a year, so we call it the Shnat Tohu. But of course, the entire period here is Tohu. So it's an amazing kind of interrelationship in which the different stages of how it is that we take a look at our connection to Ma'aseh Bereshis and our connection to the universe as a whole are dated differently, as if it's different planets. So the original sense that we have of Bereshis, which is still our best kalim that we took along in our rocket ship, which was the Teva, that ain't Achinami. That is still part of that original Bereshis, and we pretend that we still inhabit an earth that was created at that time. Nisan. But when it comes to our realities and how it is that we measure what has happened to us, where we are in the universe and so on, the only thing that we can do is account for the number of years that have passed from the model. That's all that we can do in order to be able to establish what has happened to our place. And again, once you start to understand what's happening, you can figure out exactly why those mazalas are not in the right place. Not because it happens to be that you notice a 1-degree shift every 70 years, but because you understand the nature of rotation. That's the whole point. And if you're a kid and you're playing with your little top, you're watching the precession of the equinoxes as the top turns, and it has the additional movement of turning like that, besides twisting, right? And then you understand, oh my gosh, I mean, it's not all about us after all, which of course is the ultimate discovery of your real place in the universe, right? Okay, but this is just a beautiful, beautiful understanding of what is happening over here in terms of this transition. So it's clear once Chazal tell you that the Kufas, that the Mazalas were lo shimshu, and obviously you have the most ridiculous, I mean, meaningless in terms of an actual experience, which is obviously not possible. You have the greatest possible discontinuation. And because of that, so many stages ago, because the original Olam HaTohu that we're talking about, which was the Shnas HaTohu, is a stage before the stage that we're used to counting from, which is the post-Gan Eden world, which is a stage before the Tohu that we're talking about over here of the post-Mabul up until the birth of Avram, which is a stage before Alpine Terror when we take things seriously as being part of history. There's many stages ago, right? And this is the amazing story in Yechezkel, in which we find that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says through Yechezkel the weirdest thing. He compares again and again 3 people who should try to be matzil from Puraniyut. So he says, if these 3 people were in the city, Noach, Daniel, and Eov, Noach, Daniel, and Eov, who came up with that one? Heimal b'tzidkatam yinatzu nafsham, but that's it. Or let's say chaya ra'a avir ba'aretz, huh? Shlosha anashim elu b'tocho. Oh no, they won't serve anybody. Heimal levadam yinatzu. How about if there's a war? Cherev avi ala aretz, huh? Ushloshet anashim elu, Noach, Daniel, and Eov are there. Will they save people from the war? No. How about if it's a dever? Aha! So now it's an outbreak of this new virus, killing everybody. And Noach, Daniel, Eov b'tocha. Chayoninu Hashem im beinim bat yatzilu. Im be'al b'tzidkatam yatzilu et nafsham. How do you keep repeating these 3 people? Noach, Daniel, Eov. What is the point of these 3 people? that it should be a Hatzalah because, remarkably, these three people served as transitions. So each and every one of these, as the Medrash says, as the Mepharshim explain, each and every one of these people saw three different worlds. Noah literally saw three different worlds. One planet prior to the Mabul, another planet after the Mabul, and then interstellar travel while he was in his table. Completely different levels of reality. Daniel saw a Beis Hamikdash that was built, that was Chorov, the period of the transition in Bavel with all of the immense changes. And obviously he comes to be the nature of transition in terms of the maris that are shown to him, the changes in the nature of Malchus and so on. And Eov is such a transitional figure that we even look at him as mythological, according to Aman Yama. He never existed in exactly the same way that we think about the mob. For all intents and purposes in our history, it serves nothing at all, other than the lesson that it is. And so we need here an entire year. Of course, all the Mepharshim say, well, what makes it a year if the Mazolas were not Mishamish? Is there some type of absolute time that we're going to measure the year by? What is the year? The biological functions of Noach and the animals, which are linked to outside time normally, and therefore we count the years by Noach. As what other remnants do we have for an objective time? Really? Okay. But so why do we need a year? Because the idea is that the year is always the end of the transition. The same way that you have 1,000 years of the Elef Hashvi, which is essentially Mabul-like, which Nishmoteim Shel Tzadikim and Porchim Ba'avir, and there's nothing that's there in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Really turns everything into Tohu Vavoh, which is exactly what's going on over here. That's 1,000 years. That's that concept of one of the Elefs, like you're one of the Shnois Bria. It needs to be a year. And for that erasure, just like the Elef Hashvi, we come out with new seasons, according to many Rishonim. We come out because the impact of the tipping of the earth, this is the old Velikovsky idea, that the marble and the earth being moved off of its axis is the same problem, and that it all came because of approaching too close to a planet that is passing by. He relates it to the whole moon formation and so on. Very cute. But it is Velikovsky, and he didn't do too well. But in any event, it turns out that the precession of the equinoxes obviously would have been very fundamentally built of exactly the same thing. And then according to other Rishonim, the nature of the rainbow is itself, new effects of light, new laws of optics. Even though most learn that it's just the utilization of what was from Shishim aberrations. We've always it's transition from We're back on though, on the same YouTube?
Broadcasting.
Oh, okay, fine. Shoot, okay, so nothing was lost. Baruch Hashem. Okay, so that becomes in the end, not only the Vayachal Moshe, but also becomes in the end the last hope that he has, which is in terms of his tefillah for entry into Eretz Yisrael. And so we need to understand the implications of that. I mean, obviously we have many, many words that are constructed of this, right? So the idea of tochelet, vayikal, hopefulness, of the concept of chol, which is also chula, which is the nature of chilul, in which something has been emptied out completely of all of its contents. That's the Mishnah Nazir, the idea of the aver that was nitchalel in the bright. So nitchalel, people mistake as thinking that it means killed, but obviously aver min hamet can't be killed. So nitchalel in that sense would mean taken out of its world, its placement, and left here to be on its own, which is all the other chals. To the idea of making yourself sick, in the Vayachal Moshe, that the Medrash says that's how much he davens, and obviously the beginning and the nature of Chilul Hashem, which is brought by the Rabbeinu Bachya in terms of the Azul Chal, that it created a tremendous Chilul Hashem which connects the Uhei Cheliot, Gibor Tzayid, and to the Zafilam Ma'asot. He connects them all in that sense. There's much deeper issues, however, that need to be spoken about. Probably the most powerful of them is a word that does not exist in English at all, and is the deepest meaning of chal, which is chalot. Chalot is a state of being. And there's no real way to say it in English because it's a very specific state that will define something as simple as possession. We don't see that as a state in English, and therefore we don't have a word for it. We only have beginning. We can begin your ownership. But we can't talk about the chalot of a kinyan, which completely redefines your state in all of the issues that are part of the space of that state. So once there's a chalos of kiddush, and the implications of being in that state is that everything changes. The state of Isser changes, the state of monetary relationships, ownerships, relationship to the Baal, the inyonim of Arias, everything is defined by that state, and the state can't be changed unless it goes through a transition to a different state, which has very specific ways in which that chalot can take place, which is why people who aren't familiar with the concept find it so arbitrary that, let's say, okay, Gittin, new Melis, or they got a civil divorce, and what's the big deal? It's basically the same thing, right? I mean, you're just saying that they're divorced. What's the difference when you say the Hebrew, say the English? The concept of a chalos is so distant that it just sounds like religious madness to talk to them about. You can't be not married unless something changed in terms of because you don't have the language for it. That is a very, very deep sense of referring to something that has no physical reality, that is essentially a sukkah-like construct, which is a space in which all types of other things will be defined by it. This is the reason also that when we talk about, it doesn't do anything other than what it is that it's been defined as a state of. It could be a state of Kiddush, it could be a state of Garish. But both of those states will have immense impact on everything that this person will be subsequently. Perhaps this is why, emptied from anything of its own identity, but only defining the space of the thing, is why we can use chol to mean sand. which also basically takes on not a specific identity of its own, but becomes in aggregate something different based on its container, which remarkably, when heated, turns into glass, which is essentially a liquid that is frozen but remains in its liquid state, molecularly speaking. No other substance similar to it. And because of that, remains transparent. And because of that, becomes transparent even to Tumas HaMeis, if it's an Evan Zachuch. It's quite amazing. So these ideas, we will see, are very important in understanding specifically why the Torah uses these words specifically here. What you would think the simple meaning would be is that when you're talking about something which is a completely new beginning, so then it's always going to be in terms of a new chalos of a world, and therefore by definition, a chulin, because it hasn't been defined yet, and it's left undefined until somebody does something open to new beginnings, new realities, which is exactly what happens with Nimrod and with Noach and so on and so on. Now, it's because of that that within that context, you can look at every beginning and its relationship to the idea of chen, right? Because chen and chinuch relate in the same way that chinuch becomes chalos, because it's the beginning. One of the translations of chinuch is the opening. So this is the opening of the show. But the dedication element of chinuch relates directly to the extent at which chen is defined by creating a state, and that's gam ki yaskim lo yasrum, a completely different meaning of chinuch. So it's the non-conceptual, but the self-awareness state of chinuch. Again, Moshe's third contribution is that atachonam tanu on Motzei Shabbos defines hachel aleinu hayamim habayim likraseinu, which is beautiful. Exactly the same idea. Okay, what's going to be in this coming week? Which is why we relate to Elianovi specifically, exactly the same way that Yonah Matzah Manoah would relate back to that thing in the Orvim at that time.
I have a wild one.
Okay.
The chalchala is the
end. I forgot to mention about this Chakala Malkam Or, which is the complete emptying out, which relates to Atah Chilosa. Sorry.
Right, and the chalchala is the end of the digestive tract, the transition. But there's a question of where the chalik is, at what point exactly does it end? It's a liminal.
Good. I'll hold it. Okay. Very good. Very good.
Some of word.
Excellent, excellent. So, I mean, basically, on that level, we could say that the transition of B'nai Noach on this level of Huchal is in fact Chulin. It really, the main point is to strip it down to its absolute essentials, which is how the Yerushalmi identifies Noach's Aveda as the one thing you can trust, as Koheles points out, is Ha'aretz La'olam Umadet. In other words, whatever it is that you think is new, or whatever you think is grand about your life, is, as far as Noach sees it, the cause of all of the problems of the first Asora decades. And because of that, he specifically becomes, as the Yerushalmi says, an Ikar L'Shem Ikaru. He wants to be a farmer for that essential nature of Adam, as Laved as Adam. So that's the love of Shamru. So then the simplest meaning would be, even when he comes out of Gan Eden and enters into a world of history, it's Laved as Adam Ashalukach Mishon. The idea of being the centerpiece of the Aretz, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitnachem, that he made Adam ba'aretz. And then when in the end, lo osifah b'kalel, everything, just because Adam was the middle of everything. And if I don't have an Adam, I don't need anything. That's no longer true. Now it becomes Adam v'veim atushi Hashem, which ties directly down Noach himself looks at it. He is essentially a beatnik. And in that level of beatnik, he does whatever beatniks do. First of all, he takes marijuana. In this case, it's alcohol, but it's always psychotropic substances. He strips. Not coincidentally, he becomes part of the earth in a very earthy fashion.
Wallowing, right? The sense of wallowing.
Yeah, I mean, but we don't have to make it that low level. Right? So there's a badafka commitment to the recognition that somebody who thinks that he lords it over the earth, and his das is what's kriveya, will never get the Purim, essentially. There's never going to be Adolayah. The idea of Adolayah is a fundamental tikkun, and becomes a fundamental tikkun in the end. And he's dealing with the Tahom, he's dealing with Keri and so on. I mean, that's the Berotchim Kilkalo, and Berotchim Nidono. So, I mean, it makes so much sense that he would, in fact, and he's coming to a new world. Okay, so fine, these are the things that he does. So the idea of that chalos and the chulin and what happens to Moshe, to Noah, make a lot of sense. And the truth is, the world would have been in a state of chalot, that is to say, a complete transition, a totally new world, but for a terrible problem in the whole story. Something went horrifically wrong in the Noach story, and it has three expressions: what went wrong, such that the simple connection that we would expect to find, which is the mythological connectedness, so to speak, to a Shnat Tohu, in which we're going to count the Tkufes Chana v'Levana, and a connection to an actual presence of constellations and how it is that we see our place in the world, to put those two things together and to be Derish Tkufas and Mazolas, which seems crazy. I understand that to be the meaning of how Superman would experience his relationship to Krypton on Earth. I understand that. The problem is that the transition was incomplete. And the reason it was incomplete, it expresses itself in three ways, the incompletion of that transition. One is the weird stress on the people and animals that were Mishamish B'Teva, as if this is such an important thing. So the whole future of the world is defined by the fact that Cham was Mishamish B'Teva, Kelem was Mishamish B'Teva, Orev was Mishamish B'Teva, and therefore out of Cham comes all the Kikulim of Arayas. So we have Kamaiseres Mitzrayim, Cham. Kamaiseres Canaan, Cham. The building of the Dora Pelaga and the Ir and the Migdal, entirely Cham. Because the Medrash says, Vayomer Ish Alachiv, Rashi brings this to the shine. Vayomer Ish Alachiv is in context of Nimrod. So it's basically Cush to Canaan to Mitzrayim, and it's all a Cham discussion which goes directly to Mr. Cham Nimrod. All of which is obviously a reference to the Chamimus of Arias, which is already Marunas, in the entire Mabul story, which started from the Vaikulam Nashim Mikol Asher Bacharu. But if you think about it, becomes the whole definition of the connection of the new world to the old world. Because whatever went wrong in Gan Eden, which terminates with Vaikulam Nashim Mikol Asher Bacharu, is about Arias. I mean, the idea of the interrelationship between the Ish, the Isha, and the nature of covering yourself. It's the opposite of his nakedness. All of that is the weirdest thing. All of that goes through the Teva as a transition into the new world, in which the first issue is the Mishpachoteim, to be Matir Tashmish. No good, so the world is bizarre. No, okay, so therefore what? So therefore Cham ends up raping his father, becoming Canaan. It's crazy. I mean, obviously it can't be Stam an issue the Elam is bizarre. It's a whole year we're talking about. The Elam is a bizarre. Everybody's drowned and dead. Long time ago. Okay. אותו עורב בדיוק. Amazing. Mamish amazing. Such that the whole following story of nakedness and Erev and Eretz Canaan and Eretz Mitzrayim, the loss of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, it's wild, as Rabbi Sachs points out. It's the central theme of the entire Chumash, is sex. There's nothing else that's discussed. Wherever you go, there's always some kind of problem of sex, from the beginning to the end. There's going to be Avram with taking Sarah down to Mitzrayim. It's going to be Avimelech and Yitzchak, or it's going to be Shem and rape, or it's going to be Lavan and the games. Whatever it is, it's got something to do with all of the issues that start off at the beginning, as if the main idea of Koyach Ma'asav Higid B'Amrei is the difference between the morality of Bris and Yisrael, which is also all about sex, which is the weirdest thing. For heaven's sakes, make a bris with a Kadosh Baruch Hu with a sexual organ is nuts, unless you look at this entire thing as being really meaningful all the way back to the beginning, right? What would have been if things would have worked out properly? What if there wouldn't have been Shimush B'Teva? What if there would have been a complete acceptance? Remember, the Teva was basically like Ezra's Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. Acha, so complete Shelas Nikia, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu checked every animal getting onto the Teva to make sure that they had good sexual morality. But we let in Chama, we let in the Arav, we let in the Kalef. We're supposed to know they're going to mess up on the Teva Gufa. But obviously this is pretty important if we have to make certain that whoever comes in is Tahar, and now we would have taken you out the Mishpachotehem, Ish v'Isha, as opposed to the beginning. Oh, crazy thing. And the whole idea afterwards of the bris is Moshe says, and Noach says he doesn't want to reproduce. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Inani muchan la'askim. You're right. There needs to be some level of confidence in reproduction. Otherwise, how do you know that it's worth it? That's the first expression of the problem. The second expression of the problem is that of all crazy things, can you imagine Superman having packed along in his rocket, assuming he'd been old enough, a little piece of kryptonite just to keep a memory of his planet? Because that's what Noach did. The first astronaut to Mars, what does he bring along? Marijuana. Classic. So what does he do? He goes to the Gan Eden, finds the same shatil that other Rishon got into trouble with him. And this is ridiculous. I understand the Zohar explains it's all a Shem Shemayim. He thinks he's going to be B'taken. Everything will work out fine. Obviously, you're dragging along the problems with you, right? So the transition can't possibly be mushlam if you want to drag the problems with you. And the third expression of an incomplete transition, of all nutty things to do, take Og along as your friend. The whole marvel was caused by these guys. The whole Yom Kippur becomes the kapara for Azav Azrael. So Noach is lonely. So when he hears the knocking at the side of the table, who's there? Oh, he can't resist. Of all nutty things to do, he drills a hole in the side of the teva. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's made sure no leakage, everything fine. We won't even give you a window on top according to Waman Diamar. We'll give you radium so you can have your own light. Don't worry about it. No, I've got to open up the teva and be able to feed Og. It's an unbelievable story. And of course, the result of that is that Noach's second identity in terms of the Chen Moshe Rabbeinu is he's got to get rid of Og. And this becomes a threat throughout Moshe Rabbeinu's life because the problem of the Nephilim has to be addressed by him on Maimed Har Sinai, the Ma'anosh Kitizkerenu, which of course is immediately needs to be addressed by Noach, Because as he lies there indeed wallowing, the Malach Asheros can't resist tweaking HaKadosh Baruch Hu and saying, is that the Adam we've been waiting for? Oh, no, that's just a drunkard. Don't look at that thing. We'll get moving on that. It's a hilarious medrash. But, I mean, it's with Bakesh Me'elav. So the Moenesh Kitis Kreno becomes asked again of Moshe. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, if you can't answer that question, I can't give you the Torah. So that means the entire issue is completely interrelated. These three things are an incomplete transition. By definition, I mean, it's about as incomplete as you could possibly get. So this idea of heat, the Mida Keneged Mida La Rayas, the nakedness, the Betoch Alo, the Shimush B'Teva, even the concepts of using clean language, which we learn out from Rabbeima Sherinena Torah, as this becomes the Mokkah. Turns out in the end, and to be K'mais Eretz Mitzrayim, K'mais Eretz Canaan. So you bring along basically the Yetzer Hara with, whereas as the Imre Emes points out, such a beautiful Nekuda. Because clearly the entire model, he takes this for granted, but when we think about it, it's so boring. The entire model is meant to reach this bottom line level of the identification of the Bnei Adam that becomes the Vayarcha Elokim, the Reach HaMichayach Diyan, which is the makor of the bris, the rainbow bris. Because the Tahom Rabbah, especially if you're talking about 15 malas above the Harim, is clearly an act of a saint. Sota. This is Sota. It's Mamish Sota. So what you're doing is you're taking the species and you want to see whether there's something that can come out that with all of the bad, there's something that you can trust, which ends up to becoming the Reach HaMichal. In exactly the same way that the same Tahom that is locked up afterwards comes out again at the opinion of the Beis HaMikdash, which is exactly the Shittim. So David HaMelech was being carried the Shittim. That's Sukkah. What happens? He picks up the piece that was put there at the time of Noach. Out comes the Tahom again. Does anybody know if you're allowed to erase the Shem Hashem in the Tahom, which becomes the whole test of Achitophel, which becomes, again, the Mocker of Seta, the result of which the 15 Shiramalas, which brings the water back up so that the earth is more fertile, just like the Sota herself becomes more fertile, just like the Zayin Nachamenu is obviously the higher level of fertility in the end, not the original Noach that was there before, just as Rashi tells us, the difference between Kol Mayanotom Rabbah and the V'Yisachru Mayanotom Rabbah, because you wouldn't have a Yellowstone Park if there hadn't been a nice Bible to leave all those hot pools. And what about Chamei Tveria, which is exactly the same issue as the enhanced value of the Sefer in terms of V'Niktav in Israel Zera, which Chana uses in sort of a cynical kind of way for Shmuel. You know, plaster, right? So I'm warning you, I'm going to have a kid one way or the other. So I mean, it's just an extremely dramatic kind of situation. Now it's true that, of course, Og had to pledge himself before Noach was ready to make the deal. Og had to swear up and down, I would say on his mother's grave, but I can't say that about Og. But he had to swear up and down that he was going to be an Eved Memon to Noah. He'll be Mishamishim the rest of his life, which of course was happened to the other sexy guy who was Cham and Knan. The problem is that the original Shamash Hagadol that was lost was the Noach. Vayal Shamash Gadol that we lost. And what happened out of that was that he turned into the Adai. which is Achri Soye Manon. So that in the end, you're supposed to have a Shamash Gadol that ends up being your Makar for Tashmish, which turns you into Clinton, which is a disaster, because the question is, who is in charge? Is it the Shamash or is it the other? So always the old question, so who leads, right? So it's all very nice to promise.
Explain that with opening the Shamash was the
The Mila is the Shamash, because it's the Mishamish. And the Nochash is the mocker of the Mila, because in the Hasara, the Orla, it's HaNochash Ofer Lachma, which is why you put the Orla, which had originally the penis was a phallic, which is the snake, phallic symbol. So that goes into the Nochash Ofer Lachma, which is supposed to leave you with a usable Shamash, but which unfortunately tends to be Maver Yul Daitcha. So the Shamash ends up becoming the Monon.
Right, so how does Oath fit into that now?
Well, it's all very nice that he made all these promises. He ends up being quite a problem, doesn't he? Just like the original Shamash HaGadol who made all these promises.
What's the promise of oath?
I will be your loyal servant.
And what problem did he cause later on?
He almost destroyed Klal Yisrael.
And then later on with the
Yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, he was there with Paro, and he had made fun of the Jews to Paro. Told them, yeah, little Yitzchak, squashed him between my two fingers. And he tells Paro, it's ridiculous, a Pirda can't even have babies. In walks Yaakov with the Shiva Nefesh, and Og is there, and Paro says, didn't you say you can't even have kids? It becomes like a whole, obviously things were not quite as loyal as he proclaimed he would be.
And then became Eliezer, which wasn't so.
Was that? Yeah, okay, that's the split in Og, obviously. And then you have to go back to Gan Eden and Chaim, of course. So, I mean, the truth is that it says also, it describes how big Og is, ridiculously big, right? So he eats 1,000 shvarim for lunch, you know. It's okay, Avram Avinu held him in the palm of his hand. So once Avram Avinu got angry at him and yelled at him, and he got so frightened that his tooth fell out. So Avram turned the tooth into an ivory bed. All right, so obviously the metaphorical connotations are profound here. But in any event, you know, it has a disastrous impact. Why? Because it means that mythology continues. It's not stam that we don't have a clear cut at that point that allow people to become rational. Rational people don't have oaks.
What have they?
Oaks, they don't have giants in the backyard. There's no Jack and a beanstalk. It's rational. You have to be Jack first. There's a machine. But that's because basically the Teva had room for mazikim because of the same thing. That's the Mikol Achai. That's the ones that are with the Bria, says Rashi says, but the ones that are without the Bria, that's the mazikim who don't live together with people. That itself is part of the old non-transition, where you bring mazikim along with you. But that too is part of the same issue of how much of your own brain is involved in the way that you relate to reality. Obviously, there's a completely different way of relating to a world that lives with mazikin as a theory of disease, that cures diseases by killing mazikin, and so on and so forth. That's a different planet. So too, the presence of Ogan is a different planet. It's a different world. And what that means is that leaving the Teva open to that meant that the transition to Avraham was that much more difficult.
There'd be monsters that left hanging.
Left hand.
Is Rebbe saying that they're all imaginary? Is
Imaginary is not the correct word. They're all virtual. They're all creation of your mind, which is why they're Ben Hashmashas. They require Adam to be there in order to exist.
Do they exist? Don't they exist?
Right?
Do they exist or don't they exist?
People don't believe in them. What happened to poor Tinkerbell, remember? Did you clap or not?
Let me grow up with
But the seeds were meant to be brought along with the sperm. The sperm was inside.
There's no meant to, except the way that it works out. Obviously, everything is meant to. But the Pesach for the meaningfulness of virtual creatures and a reality that is not a complete reality is this one expression. And I'm telling you, the transition was not sholem, and it expresses itself in Og and Mazikim, in Shimush B'Teva, in bringing along the Shtil from Gan Eden. All of these things were done in a way that ended up being destructive, which is why we view the chulin of Noach as being a chilul. What do you have to start with that? So that's what the Amen says. So since it says, how did he go plant? Why did he go drink wine? He should have made himself a nazir. Very cute.
It's a chulin.
Huh?
That's what it was mechala.
Yeah. Very, very cute. He just takes for granted, obviously, was a getter of Satan.
The transition is not complete because we have still the remnants of the previous world, the
Correct.
connections.
Correct. And because of that, the tohu continues. So the tohum rabbah, which relates to the mokum of tohu and so on, continues. And it continues until the end of Alpayim Tov.
Because Og is around much longer.
Right, but Og's personality, obviously, he becomes part of history at that point. It's his entire connection to the Rephaim ends with Knesset Eretz Yisrael, which is the final, as we'll see, the meaning of Kayach Ma'asav Higit Liyama, which is no longer a place for virtual realities. But that we'll get to in the second part of this year. So let us close now, take an interrupt, 5 minutes maybe, so that we have a chance to make it in time in terms of Arvit for the second piece. We were supposed to start the second piece 7:30, so if there's anybody looking, I don't think we're not here. Okay, so let's.
3 whole viewers.